previous video in this series, Part 8, entitled Barkers and Gevedons in the Civil War, Battle of Princeton, ended with a victory for Marshall's army, including the 5th Kentucky Infantry at Princeton, West Virginia in May 1862, against a substantial Union army that was threatening an important rail line and salt mine. It was a great morale booster, but the Kentucky boys were still itching to get back to their home state for which they had originally signed up to defend. In the 7 months since its formation, the 5th Kentucky Infantry, that included the Barkers and Gevedons, had possibly exchanged gunfire with Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes and Sergeant William McKinley at Princeton and Colonel James A. Garfield previously at Middle Creek in January. It is interesting to contemplate the possibility that our ancestors may have figured into the course of American history by not killing 3 future presidents. On May 19, the day after the Battle of Princeton, the U.S. Congress passed the first of several Homestead Acts, giving away 160 acres of land in the territories to adventurers who agreed to reside on it for 5 years. Any who had taken up arms against the government weren't eligible and was intended to stop the spread of slavery into the territories. The taming of the West began in earnest and would include the subjugation of the Plains Indians by the near annihilation of the American bison in little more than 20 years. After the battle, General Marshall moved his army back to Jeffersonville, just east of Tazewell in Tazewell County, Virginia. It included the 5th Kentucky Infantry, the 29th and 54th Virginia Infantries, and other assorted units. On May 27, Edward Garrett wrote, quote, "In the evening, General Marshall, in person on his big black mare, drilled the 5th Kentucky and Shawhan's cavalry. Had a sham battle, very exciting and interesting. A brigade of ladies present," unquote. Within a week, news arrived of the fall of Fort Pillow, guarding Memphis, with the city falling 2 days later, but was offset by news of Stonewall Jackson's juggernaut in the Shenandoah Valley, with successive Confederate victories at Fort Royal, Port Republic, and Cross Keys, Virginia, making General McClellan look bad and driving President Lincoln to distraction. Meanwhile, Barkers and Gevedons were mired in the day-to-day boredom of camp life at Jeffersonville after the adrenaline rush of victory at Princeton, West Virginia. They worked, drilled, and tried to stay cool while the war seemed to have frozen them in a state of limbo, as the real action to the east under Lee and Jackson was making all of the headlines. It's hard to say if they embraced the relative safety and inactivity more than the excitement and sheer terror of leading an entire division into battle. The 2 weeks they were at Jeffersonville, they kept an eye on their old Middle Creek foes, the boys of the 40th Ohio Infantry under Bull Nelson, who had reoccupied Prestonsburg, Kentucky, and crossed into Virginia and raided Gladeville, now Wise, and burnt part of the town before withdrawing. On June 19th, what had been the South's fear and one of the main causes of the war came to pass when President Lincoln signed into law a bill prohibiting slavery in all current and future Western territories, a repudiation of the 1857 Dred Scott decision. Josie Underwood wrote in her diary at Bowling Green, Kentucky, quote, "It is becoming plain that neutrality can't be maintained much longer, for while the older conservative men think it the best means to preventing the legislature passing an ordinance of secession, all of the young men in the state are eager to be decidedly in the fight on one side or the other. Dear Pa is getting more hopeless, but does not waver in his allegiance to the old Constitution and his determination that he will do all he can to preserve the Union and bring the seceded states back," unquote. In the last week of June, General Robert E. Lee made a spectacular entrance onto the main stage of the war by routing General McClellan's army at Gaines Mills, Virginia. His and Jackson's victories set back the Union war effort by nearly a year and renewed the flagging hopes of the Southern cause. On the 4th of July, Edward Garrett lamented, quote, "This is the glorious anniversary of the declaration of our former independence. This day 86 years ago, our fathers declared we would be free, and today we'll prove it or baptize it in our own lifeblood," unquote. On the same day, in England, Lewis Carroll made up a story for 10-year-old Alice Liddell, the daughter of a friend, about a girl who fell down a rabbit hole. She liked it so much she asked him to write it down, and he initially titled it Alice's Adventures Underground. 5 days later, Confederate General John Hunt Morgan left Knoxville with his fast-moving cavalry and entered Kentucky on the first of several hit-and-run raids designed to surprise, disrupt, and terrorize communities sympathetic to the Union, destroying railroad and telegraph lines, seizing supplies, taking prisoners, and generally wreaking havoc. His 17-day march took him up through Tompkinsville, Glasgow, Lebanon, Harrodsburg, Georgetown, and Cynthiana, before heading south again through Paris, Winchester, Richmond, and Somerset, and back to Tennessee. It sealed his nickname as the Thunderbolt of the Confederacy, and would not be his last raid. On July 11, an ominous notice appeared in the Richmond, Virginia Daily Dispatch entitled "Curious Cannon," describing the capture of a Union gun with, quote, "a hopper like a coffee mill intended to feed the instrument, which with vigorous turning of a crank was capable of loading and discharging itself 60 times per minute," unquote. They were, of course, describing a terrible new weapon invented by Dr. Richard Gatling. Gatling naively claimed it would reduce the size of armies and thus the number of deaths by combat and disease, and show the futility of war. Later, the inventor of the improved self-powered machine gun, as well as Alfred Nobel, who invented the stable explosive dynamite, would use similar justification. During the last week of July, the 5th Kentucky and the rest of what was now Williams' army learned they would be re-entering Kentucky as part of a new coordinated offensive, and on August 2nd, Jack May was ordered to take 2 companies, most likely his primary Company A with the Barkers and Gevedons, and George Noble's Company I, to Grundy, Virginia, 30 miles closer to home. They were to be the point of the spear once again in the long-planned coordinated invasion of their state, but they had no idea of the scale of the plans. George Noble said, quote, "That put me in a high way. That night I saw a comet, or blazing star, as it was called. The next night I saw it right plainly. I said that another war was at hand, for father had said it was a sign of war," unquote. Noble was talking about Comet Swift-Tuttle that had been discovered only 2 weeks earlier. Our ancestors no doubt saw it too, and one wonders what they made of it. In an eerie connection to them, the author of this video photographed the same comet from his backyard in Saginaw, Michigan when it reappeared in 1992, 130 years after his great-grandfather Henry M. Barker admired it from Grundy, Virginia, under much different circumstances. While at Grundy, news arrived that the 40th Ohio had withdrawn from Prestonsburg, Kentucky, to pursue Morgan's raiders, but they would be too slow to corner the swift and nimble Confederates on their lightning attacks, and May took advantage, re-entering Kentucky at the head of the Big Sandy River, and occupied Pikeville with his 2 companies of the 5th Kentucky. May's men stayed for only a week before continuing to Prestonsburg and camped not far from the site of their battle at Middle Creek in January. As news spread of the 5th Kentucky's return, combined with the spectacular success of Morgan's raiders, many of the men who had deserted Marshall's army when it left the state a second time began to trickle into camp with high hopes of finally taking Kentucky back from the Union Army. Perhaps more would have returned had they known the magnitude of the planned invasion. The same week, the Lakota Sioux began the Sioux Uprising due to broken treaties by the U.S. government and killed 24 soldiers of the 5th Minnesota Regiment. The uprising spread to the Santee Sioux, who attacked Fort Ridgely, Minnesota. Already 800 settlers were dead, and it was a much unwanted distraction for President Lincoln. 38 Sioux warriors would be executed the day after Christmas, 1862. The Sioux's short-lived revenge would come 14 years later against Yellow Hair at the Battle of the Greasy Grass, or what the U.S. would call the Little Bighorn. By the middle of August, it was still hurry up and wait for the 5th Kentucky trying to stay cool at Prestonsburg. They were waiting on the rest of Marshall's army to follow them into Kentucky, but the logistics of a large supply train and, unknown to the common soldiers, coordination with 2 more large Confederate armies for a planned massive invasion of the state were delaying any further progress. It would come soon enough. Look for part 10 in this video series.